Hi, everyone. Welcome to this first presentation of the Insights Alliance's new Missing Audiences survey, covering fieldwork from September and October of 2021. My name is Robin Cantrell-Fennick. I'm from Baker Richards, and if this is your first Insights Alliance presentation, a particular welcome to you. We are Indigo, One Further, and Baker Richards working together to gather and share data from audiences to inform the recovery and the reimagination of the sector. That's what we're doing today, so thank you very much for being here. And we've been doing this for the past 16 months after the interval survey, which was created by Indigo, and then Culture Restart, where the Alliance has been working together since then. Now, just to say up front, we will of course share the slides and a recording afterwards. But aside from me, today during the presentation, you will hear from my colleague David Rees from Baker Richards, from Katie Rains at Indigo, and from Chris Unit from One Further as well. So the Missing Audiences survey was the next logical step after Culture Restart. So let's look at what we were trying to find out and why. Well, first of all, why have some audiences not yet returned? That's the big question. And if they're not returning, what have they been doing instead? Have they been substituting in-person experiences with digital alternatives? How are they feeling about eventually coming back in person? And what part do COVID safety measures still play? Well, in this webinar, we're going to present the data as it relates to both in-venue experience and digital, but we're also going to go on to talk about what we think the implications of the data are, what the story is that's emerging from the data so far, and what the next chapters might look like. So to start taking us through the numbers, I'm going to hand over to my colleague, David Rees from Baker Richards. Over to you, David.
Hello, thanks, Robin. So just to give you some kind of top level numbers as to who we surveyed and who it was sent out to, we have a total on this particular survey of nearly 11,000 respondents, a survey between the 13th of September and the 25th of October across 50 different participating organizations. And just to say that the premise for this for organizations was that they were sending it out to respondents or to bookers on their database who had not yet booked for their particular organization since COVID. So we really wanted to find out what they were thinking, what they were up to. So just to mention though, at the start, that actually when we asked people, have you attended the organization who sent you this survey? There were some who had actually attended. So obviously those people who potentially didn't book but came with other people. So that's over here, this 11% here. But actually 44% of the sample has attended, just not to the organization that sent out the survey. So there's a big chunk of people who are returning, but not potentially to your organization. There's a smaller chunk of people, 13% here in this pink bucket, who have made a booking for future, just not yet come back yet. And then this other chunk of people, another third, who have not been back to anything at all. So what we thought we would do is we'd just try and understand those a little bit more detail by segmenting them. So what we wanted to kind of give you a sense of is what types of people have responded to the kind of the Missing Audiences survey. And actually, if you split it out between those that have attended and those that haven't attended, about 57% of the respondents have attended something, whereas the remaining 43% have either not yet attended or are not planning to attend at all. So within those, we've got three segments of attenders. Let's start with those over at the left-hand side here. So we've got what we've called back to normal. So this is about a quarter of the respondents. And actually what we found is that they're mostly behaving as they were pre-COVID. They're fairly frequent. They're kind of driven by programming. And if they have not returned to the surveying organization, it's largely because there hasn't been anything they wanted to see at that organization. But they're certainly in the market. Then next to those, we've got the cautious returners. So about a fifth, 19% of the respondents. And they are they were previously frequent attenders, but now they're attending less frequently than they were. And what they are concerned about are safety measures still being in place. Programming is still key. And in fact, programming is key for a lot of these segments. But for them, safety is almost as important. And then the third segment amongst the attenders are the smaller not to theatre attenders. So these are people who have been back to cultural events. They just haven't been to any indoor events. So they've been to outdoor venues, museums and heritage sites. And generally that's because they tend to be avoiding interacting with crowds of people. And then amongst the non-attenders, there's a small chunk of people, that's the same 13%, who said they had made plans to, who are in this now fourth segment. So they haven't yet attended a cultural event, but they've got tickets for something in future. And then finally, the third of the sample that is essentially just holding out, they just haven't returned to any cultural venue and they don't intend to, or they have no plans to in the immediate future. And then if you look at the kind of what's most important to them and why have they not returned from a kind of on a scale of this kind of what's the main reason, over on the left amongst the attenders, the reason that they haven't returned particularly to your venue is largely due to programming choices, whereas those further on the right-hand side and non-attenders amongst them are largely not returning because of COVID. So we're going to explore this a little bit more detail now. But just before we get into some of the other questions, a few things to keep in mind with our sample. And this is true across all segments. Firstly, you should be aware that this is an older sample. So 90% are over 45, 75% are over 55. They're also therefore likely to be retired. 60% of that sample is retired. But we do have good spread across all UK regions, including across the 4 nations. They were also previously quite frequent attenders. So pre-COVID, 80% of them stated that they came 4 or more times a year. So this is a really core kind of theatre going audience that we're talking about here. So let's start answering some of those questions that Robin put to you earlier. So firstly, why have some audiences not yet returned? Although we've just seen some of them have returned, just not to you. So if we look at these in turn and look at those that have attended something, of the reasons that they hadn't been back to the surveying organisation, the predominant reason was really programming. So down here at the bottom, there hasn't been anything I wanted to see. And 40% of those people who have returned to something said that that's why they hadn't been back to the organisation that sent them the survey. But still a fifth of them, 20%, were saying that they're avoiding interacting with crowds of people. So there's still caution amongst them. And if you look at this on a segment level, actually what you find is that the back to normal segment, there's over 60% of them had said that actually it's programming that really is the reason I haven't been back to that organisation. And the other reasons are just far less important. So you can see how they compare to the average. Throw in the cautious returners, on the other hand, actually the cautious returners, they are concerned about interacting with crowds of people, more so than the program. So safety measures being really important for those attenders. And equally so the non-attenders, the not to theatre segment. And more so avoiding crowds of people, hence the reason they're not going to indoor places and sticking with outdoor sites for now. And then same question for those that haven't attended. In this, you see actually what is coming through as the most, the biggest reason for not returning is avoiding interacting with crowds of people. So nearly half of that segment, those 2 segments, has said that that was the reason they hadn't been back. And again, if you look at this by the individual segments, the made plans to, slightly less likely to have said avoiding interacting with crowds of people, whereas the ones that are holding out more likely to have said that that's the main reason they're not returning. And then if we look at the holding out a little bit more and ask them if they had to say now how they're feeling about booking or planning a visit, which of the options below would they choose? And we gave them a series of options here from actually, have you already booked, happy to book or visit now if there's something they want to see, of which about 20% of people said that that's how they feel at the moment. But the vast majority of them, 55%, had chosen this option, which is they'd rather wait until the COVID risk is lower than it is now. 15% said they'd rather wait until they can attend in the usual way. And then a small percentage over here, less than 10%, said that they're not planning to book or visit at all, ever. So a minority. But I guess the issue is what to do about these 55% who are waiting for COVID risk to be lower than it is now. This is clearly something outside of organizations' control. So the second question we have on here, if they're not returning, what have they been doing? So we gave them quite a long list of activities and asked them to respond as to if they've been doing them a little, a lot, or not at all in past months. So if we start with the non-attenders, and these are both the segments grouped together on this one, and just pull out the kind of the most common 4 activities that people have been doing. So either it was seeing friends and family outdoors in gardens or public spaces, of which 31% of the non-attenders have been doing a lot recently. 61% have been doing it a little bit, and only 8% have not been doing that at all. Moving from outdoors to inside their homes, it drops a little bit. So 17% have been doing that a lot, 67% a little, 50% not doing that. And then the third and fourth most common activities that we asked about were eating or drinking outdoors, of which 11% doing it a lot, 63% a little, and then switching to indoors, the numbers drop off again. So I guess the question then is, how does that compare to the people who have been attending, and is there any difference in what they have been doing? So if we move to those people, what you find is that largely they've been doing the same things, but they've been doing it more frequently. So the dark green area of their charts here is more predominant. So 39% have been seeing friends and families outdoors, 29% in homes, a lot. And actually the indoors and outdoors, there's no distinction between the people in its kind of order. So actually indoors and outdoors is both kind of a common activity for the people who have attended. But actually what this is really driven by, if we focus on the eating or drinking indoors and just break that down by segment, really the only segment that's kind of driving that increased frequency of activity is the back to normal segment, who have been doing almost all of those activities a lot more than everybody else. So everybody else is slightly more cautious. So then a third question, have they been substituting in-person experiences with digital alternatives? I think I'm going to bring in Chris Unit from One Further to answer this question. Over to you, Chris.
Chris, you're on mute. You're on mute. There we go.
Typical. I got into such a good flow there as well. Lovely. Thank you, David, and Robin as well. So one of the questions that we've been asked an awful lot is all this digital activity just a stopgap for people who aren't attending yet, and it's a fad and it'll go away? So the answer is partly, but certainly not by any stretch of the imagination only. So we can have a look here. So what we can see here is that most of our segments have engaged with culture online at some point. And across the board, a decent chunk of each segment has engaged that way in the past year. That proportion is higher for the cautious returners and the not to theatre segments, which you might explain as a way for those people to keep their hand in and to carry on engaging with something that they love, but from a bit more of a distance, or at least to be able to do that more regularly in that kind of way. You'll see that the not attended folks are least likely to have engaged a lot online. We can speculate around that. We might speculate that for some of these people, attending shows is a social thing, and that the show, the concert, the art is incidental to that. And that social experience is something that the culture online hasn't really cracked for the most part. Or it could just be that they're not really that into going to theatre or concerts or what have you, full stop. The next question that we asked people who have engaged online if they've been doing that as a substitute for attending in person. So probably no surprises here. The happier people are to return to venues, the less likely they are to say that they're getting their culture fix online as a direct substitute for that. But we can also see in this that the substitution effect isn't the only reason for accessing culture online. If you think back to the previous slide, 27% of our back to normal segment have engaged online since venues reopened. So their reasons for doing this will be different. And if you cast your mind back to some of the other studies that we've done after the interval and so on, we saw that a lot of people engaged with this stuff and found that it was a better experience than they were expecting. So hopefully that's there's some of that carrying over. It's become a slightly more normal thing to consider doing. And finally, we asked people who had accessed culture online if they're planning to do so in the future. And so the vast majority indicated that they intend to mix things up. So some in venue, some in home. We've got our hardcore non-attenders being a bit of an exception, possibly reinforcing the idea that a good chunk of them just genuinely aren't all that bothered about cultural offerings, perhaps. So I think looking at some of these numbers, some of the indicators we've got here, is this level of interest from your existing audience is going to be enough to justify a program of digital activity? That's going to be up to you to decide. One of the things that we'd like to repeat that we've been saying for some time really is that if your digital activity is going to be successful and sustainable, it needs to reach out beyond your core audience. Katie Rains from Indigo is going to talk about that side of things in a lot more detail later on. And also, I mean, we've been looking at the landscape more broadly as well. In terms of demand, everyone has quite reasonably expected that from the huge uptick in interest that we saw last year, there will be a decrease to something resembling a more normal baseline. But speculating that that level of interest will be higher than it was pre-pandemic. And if you look at stats from across the board, looking at e-commerce and other digital services, everything was kind of at one line, big spike, and it's come down to something at a more elevated level. But of course, the landscape has shifted quite a bit over the last 18 months with different organizations trying different things. So we've now got things that we didn't have before. So one example would be the National Theatre's NT at Home. There's Home in Manchester with their new home screen offer, and Rambert, who have their classes that they offer through their home studio. Home being quite a big word in all of these. We've also seen, we're starting to see some interesting research coming out. So Richard Misek at the University of Kent revealed that some of their forthcoming findings, that about 56% of funded theatres that have put work online during the pandemic have nothing scheduled for their current autumn 2021 season. He's referred to a digital divide between organisations that have been able to invest in this kind of activity and those that haven't. And what we're seeing is that there is potentially an audience for this kind of stuff if you get the offer and the distribution right. For the time being and ongoing, it looks like the spoils are going to be mopped up by the organisations that are willing, able, and see an opportunity for doing that. Or organisations and potentially individuals who aren't what you might call the established legacy cultural organisations. So lots of interesting things in there. I'm going to pass back to David from Baker Richards again now.
Thanks, Chris. So question 4, how are audiences feeling about coming back in person? So a series of questions that we asked them here. First one, as things stand today, in the next 12 months, do you expect to attend cultural events and venues more or less than pre-COVID? So again, broken down by segment, and what you can see is kind of swathes of this red color in here, which unfortunately means they plan to attend less often than pre-COVID, with the exception of the back to normal, who are mostly going to attend about the same, or in a few of them a little bit more often. But I think what we're seeing here is that largely those audiences plan to attend less frequently in future. However, it's not all bad news, because when asked, have they made any bookings for cultural events in the future, either themselves or someone they're attending with, or planned any visits to cultural organisations, there's quite a lot of blue in this chart. Blue meaning yes. So the darker blue meaning more than one. So that's good. That back to normal, you can see 67% of them are saying that they've made multiple bookings for the future. So a reflection of the fact that they are planning to attend about as frequently. Cautious returners also made, 43% of them have made multiple bookings for the future as well. So whilst they are cautious, if there's something they want to see, they will book for it. Not to theatre, slightly less likely to have booked something for future. Made plans to, as their name suggests, have made, all of them made bookings for future. And obviously the holding out have not at all. And focusing again on those holding out, there was a question that we asked: if you were considering booking a ticket for a cultural performance today, which of the following would you consider first? There are actually, I think, 6 different options on our list, and the full report will be able to kind of show you all of those. But the top 3, interesting, the top one that came out for everybody was the performance or program. So clearly everything comes back to how appealing is that performance or program to those audiences. But for the holding out, the kind of the second most important feature was the COVID safety measures at the venue. And it's almost as important as the performance or program. So I think it's getting both of those things right, which are the only things that are really going to convince the holding out segment to start booking again. So now, question 5. I'm going to hand you over to my colleague Robin to take you through this one.
Thanks very much, David. So let's move on to talk about COVID safety measures, where the data is actually really clear, as it has often been before, although in fact large parts of our industry are not acting at the moment in line with what audiences have been telling us. So let's start with the prospect of removing all restrictions and the venue operating as it was pre-COVID. The red bars show the proportion of respondents who would be less likely to attend if the venue were operated with all restrictions removed. So starting from the top, removing all restrictions would be a turn-off for 40% of the audiences who are our so-called back to normals. So for a sizable minority of those people, some safety measures are what's part of the mix of helping them to get back to those normal levels of attendance. In the green on that first row, just a little under a quarter of that first segment say that they would be more likely to attend if all restrictions were removed. So just under a quarter of that one segment. For most respondents, the headline is these big red bars. Loosening restrictions makes most respondents, whether they've come back yet or not, less likely to book. So establishing and enforcing some COVID safety measures is a net positive action. Some of the debate around the safety measures and how they relate to access to the arts actually needs flipping on its head, because safety measures improve access. That's what's coming through from the data. This has been the case throughout all of our research to date, and it remains the case now. We went on to ask about being asked to show a vaccine passport or evidence of a recent negative test as a condition of entry. And this is timely. Passports are still voluntary in England. They're only required in Scotland for pretty large or unseated events. But they are coming into effect for theatres and cinemas in Wales from Monday. And many Northern Irish venues are signed up to a standardised form of COVID safety check using common language that is aligned to the EU standards. So that's proof of vaccination, proof of a negative test, or proof of natural immunity. So for context, there are numerous EU countries using COVID passports routinely. Just this week, Denmark reintroducing the Corona Pass system, having scrapped it only a few weeks ago. And England is in many ways a real outlier on this when we look at our neighbours. And there is an English bias in our responses to this question too. So it's actually really striking that here again, respondents have told us that vaccine or test passports are a real net positive. From an access perspective, they encourage substantially more people than they deter. While this poses a logistical challenge to the venues, a clear majority of audiences are basically fine with vaccine passports or proof of a negative test as a requirement of entry. Looking at those bottom 2 rows, those audiences who haven't yet returned, we can see there that 2/3 say that knowing that everyone has to present a passport or a negative test result would make them more likely to book. Just a bit of obvious context, though. Of course, it is far better if the industry as a whole, or a nation, or the country at large has a standardized approach to this, rather than a patchwork of venues doing their own thing. Onto mask wearing now. Most people tend to agree that mask wearing at all times would make them more likely to book. Only the back to normals in that first row have a somewhat mixed picture here, and that's to be expected. They're reflecting the experience that they've had to date, where mask enforcement has generally been pretty low. But still, more than 2/3 of that first segment are positive or neutral about mask wearing. And in every other segment, when we look at those green bars, a clear majority say that mask wearing at all times would make them more likely to book. If you saw the last Culture Restart presentation, you'll know that in a nutshell, the data showed us that looking at frequent attenders in the round, there was a small group of people for whom compulsory mask wearing was really essential, an even smaller group for who were as fervently opposed. But by far the largest group in the middle were basically okay with mask wearing. They're content to do what you require them to do as a condition of entry. Just a quick anecdote to illustrate this. Last month, I went to 2 theatre shows in 2 different venues in the same city, exactly a week apart. The shows were targeting such similar audiences that it was one of those experiences where I recognised quite a few faces on both nights. I know both venues really well, and both rightly pride themselves in being inclusive and accessible and excellent. They're both great venues. But one had chosen to go very low key with safety messaging. They were their usual friendly selves, and I arrived to something that in many ways felt like an attempt pre-pandemic business as usual, but with the house about a fifth full, with exceptionally little mask wearing. And, you know, I had patrons right behind me, literally breathing down my neck. And in the interval, I actually went and moved right to the back of the auditorium to give myself a bit more space from those around me. But the next week, I'm in a different venue, same town, and it's a capacity crowd, absolutely heaving, with almost total mask wearing by the audience. So what was the difference? Well, the difference in audience numbers was predominantly down to what was on, but the difference in mask wearing was down to the entry conditions and the communications. So let's go through what that second venue did. So firstly, looking at the communications when booking and pre-visit, at the top of every page of their website was this message: as a condition of entry, we require you to wear a face mask when you are in the theatre, unless you're exempt, and a version of that appeared on my email with my ticket. On arrival, ticket check had been moved to the external perimeter of the building. Every usher had a really visible supply of masks, and they just said to me on the way in, just so you know, you're required to keep your mask on at all times once you're inside. And then once in the venue, multiple signs in every kind of public space where you would gather. But they also had ushers very visibly wearing masks, and they did that thing that, you know, predominantly commercial venues do, where the ushers walked up and down the aisles just before the show started, whereas they would very often have a kind of no phones sign holding up. They had the no phones sign in one hand and a picture of a mask in the other. Now, there are people who have a genuine exemption from mask wearing, of course, but for those who are able to wear masks, which is the vast majority of us, getting that vast majority of the audience to mask up, to wear masks, can be done. And the data that we're seeing is both clear and consistent. You should require your audience to wear masks throughout this winter, at least. It really will aid your recovery. And it is as simple as that. I'm now going to bring in my colleague, Katie from Indigo, to take us forward.
Thanks, Robin. Thank you. Right. I feel suitably told off if I'm not wearing a mask now. So what the heck does that all mean then? Well, firstly, I think it means that we need to continue to reassure audiences, both those who have returned and those who haven't. And if any of you haven't seen our 5 reassurances model, this pulls out the 5 key themes that have emerged from all the research we've done so far, and basically give you a steer on how to reassure people in lots of different ways. Please take a look at that on our site, as it's really important that you understand how much reassurance people need. Although it gets boring for us saying the same thing over and over again, they do still need it. So moving on. But I wish I could tell you that that was going to be enough. Just taking a handful of the stats that David and Chris and Robin have talked us through, I think the stark truth is that although some previously frequent people are coming back, half of those people, even the ones who've been back, are planning to come less often. Half of the respondents haven't been back to anything. And remember, these were previously regular attenders, and a third are waiting for something, either for things to get back to normal or for COVID rates to drop. I don't know what they would have to drop to for them to be confident. So if we're relying on what for many of us was a tried and tested business model where our loyal and frequent supporters and visitors made up the largest proportion of our income and attendances, I think we might come a bit unstuck. Now, I'm not sure how many of you have used the Ansoff growth matrix before, but I'm a big fan of it, as those of you who've worked with me will know, as a way of thinking about audience development and our approach to it. So I think it might help us to start figure out what's going on. So apologies to those of you who've used this lots before, but I'll just talk you through it. The basic idea is that you think about your audience development strategy as the relationship between your program and your audience in 4 different boxes. On one axis, we have audiences, so whether they're existing audiences and the same kinds of people, or whether they're new and different types of audiences, so that's the one going upwards. And then on the other axis, we have program and experiences, whether these are the same kinds of things that you've always been doing, or whether you're branching out into new territory. So in the bottom box on the left-hand side, how is getting existing audiences to come to you, your usual product, how is that audience development? Well, I would argue it is audience development, because you should be trying to develop loyalty and increase loyalty and frequency from those people and get them to come back more often to the things that they love. And the next box to the right of that is existing audiences coming to new things and new experiences. So that's audience development, because you're persuading them to take more risks into unfamiliar territory and hopefully deepen their engagement with you. Then on the new audiences for your existing work, that's basically what a lot of people mean when they say audience development, diversifying our audience for what we already do. Now, there's no right or wrong answer in terms of how much time and effort you place in each of these boxes or have done in the past, but this tool can help you think about where you want to be, whether you're investing time and effort for the long term. Now, this is really important, because the further you get away from that bottom left-hand box, the more money and time needs to be invested. And so in that top right-hand box, we get to diversification, which is where you're basically creating different products and services in order to get a new audience. So I don't know where you saw your program and your audiences against a model like this before COVID, but I think it's important now to examine what you were doing and to have really honest conversation about what it was delivering. And the reason that I say this is because I think from the data we've seen in a post-COVID world, this is going to look quite different. The bottom left box used to be the foundation of any good audience development strategy. So getting the people who've engaged with you previously to come back to similar stuff more often, build loyalty and frequency, the heart of many membership schemes. And in reality, for many organizations, where over half the income might come from, in some cases a lot more. But this is the box, the foundation that's now, I would say, in grave peril, because the very attenders that were propping up our income and our frequency levels are the demographic least likely to come back. And those who are doing say they're going to do so less frequently. And we've seen them attending less frequently, and some of them perhaps investing more on one big night out for one thing rather than coming to 3 or 4. So whilst our focus was on building loyalty, I think our challenge now is to maintain and reassure these people and to be really clear what their top program choices are, because we know that programming is really key. But however well we message those reassurances, I don't think these people are going to return at anywhere near the levels that we need them to. For this to be sustainable and for it to have the same emphasis as it did before. If 60 or 80% of what you did before was in this box, and your efforts and marketing spend was in this box, you need to start shifting things to the other 3 boxes quickly. So the second box at the bottom, instead of trying to get existing audiences to try new things, are we perhaps instead looking at modifying our products or experiences for existing audiences, perhaps the formats, adapting the formats to make them more appealing or acceptable? Now, many of you have already started with this shift, doing things like moving outdoors, such as the RSC's Garden Theatre or Home Ground in Manchester, or moving work online, as Chris was talking about, like the Young Vic committing to stream everything, offering safe formats to consume at home while audiences might be reluctant to come back. But of course, we've all been talking about the extent to which they will deliver alternative experiences for that audience, especially if you're only thinking about your existing audience with those, as Chris said, and how easy is it to monetize that, and how financially sustainable is it? And I've seen many organizations get a bit stuck there in their thinking, rightly so, understandably so, given the speed of change that's been going on, focusing on the existing audience and moving heaven and earth to super serve them, often because they have the loudest voices and the deepest pockets. But I think we need to talk about the new audience bit. We move on to new audiences for existing work. If your core audience isn't there in the same numbers anymore, to what extent is your old model going to appeal to different kind of audiences if it wasn't before? Why will it suddenly be appealing to them now? The chances are, if you've worked in arts marketing as long as I have, you'll know that we've all tried for years to flog the same old stuff to different people. And yet, if we're honest, really brutally honest, we've seen how the profile of our audiences hasn't really changed in 20 years overall as a sector. And now it's not just a moral imperative that it does, but it's a commercial one. So, as I said, if you haven't started having this type of conversation, and I'm sure you have, but if you haven't in your organization, hopefully you can see why you need to quite quickly. And then, of course, there's the top right-hand box. So we called this diversification before. And this was where organizations tried to adapt or completely re-engineer their offer in order to attract a brand new audience. We know, those of us who've tried to do it, we know this is really hard work. It takes time, it takes investment, and is often done at the fringes of an organization's work, sometimes by the learning and outreach team or by separately funded community projects. It's been historically underfunded and not really seen as core work by many organizations because it wasn't, and it didn't need to be. But I think the threat of the old model not really working for us anymore means we now need to bring the thinking needed for that box right into the heart of the organization. And if you're already doing that in your organization, congratulations and thank you. And we need you now to help the rest of us understand how to do that. Now, I'm not an expert on this stuff, and there's a lot more to say on it. So there's others much better versed than I am on this stuff. Nina Simon, for one, who I'm sure many of you have read her book, The Art of Relevance. If you haven't, it's really quick to read and it's well worth it. And basically, I do think it all comes back to relevance. What do the people in our communities need and want, and how can culture help to deliver that? We definitely need more research and data to understand that. And that's something that we're putting a lot of thought into at the Insights Alliance at the moment. But it strikes me that we will need to be thinking differently about everything, about our assets, our buildings and our people, to be ready to challenge the norm in every sense. It might mean doing things in different spaces and to actively look for ways of partnering with other organisations to do this. I think that may be the key. So there's a small recent example in my own city in Birmingham, where the CBSO have teamed up with the Hockley Social Club to deliver a new series of symphonic sessions in an outside bar. And finally, a thought about the innovation that's needed to make this happen. This is something called the funnel of innovation. And I love this graphic because it changes the idea that innovation is a sort of light bulb that just switches on one morning in your head and you go, I've got it. To one where it's a rigorous process of generating ideas, sifting, developing and testing them. And the idea that, for each idea that actually succeeds, we might have had to generate 50 and throw away 49. How good are we at doing that? How have the funding models allowed us to do that? I know you're thinking, how on earth do we do that with our current funding model? And I know this sort of thinking is high on the agenda for many of the funders at the moment, including Arts Council England and some of the lottery funds, and I'm sure the funders in the other nations as well, because obviously this is going to need a different funding model if we're really going to crack it. But together we do need to crack it. And I think the key is together. The more we can learn from each other on the way, the quicker we'll get there. So that's all I wanted to say on that today. And I'd be really interested to continue that conversation with you over the next few months. Obviously, as usual, you can download the report that we've created. There will be a second wave of missing audiences, which you can join if you want to, if you haven't been part of that, or if you have, please do sign up to be part of that, because we'll be running that in the new year to find out a bit more about missing audiences. And I'm going to hand back over to Robin to handle some Q&As.
Thank you very much, Katie, and thank you to everyone who has been sending in questions and comments during the stream. David, I'm just going to take the slides out for a moment, but I wonder if I could ask you to jump back to slide 28, please. We had an email that came in during the webinar, which said that these are the results that are just for the audiences that haven't returned. Would these safety measures, vaccine passports / compulsory masks, put off the customers that currently are booking? So I just want to reiterate on that. Let's bring that back in, that there are 3 segments there up top who actually are booking. They may not have returned to theatre, they may not have returned to you, but they are booking. And the story that is coming through is that most of those audience segments are encouraged by masks. Thank you very much, David. Shall we stick with masks? It's definitely the subject that is exercising, I think, our attendees the most. So let me bring in some comments. So we've got CBSO here. Thank you very much. With the lack of a government directive, in England at least, hugely challenging for venues and companies to keep everyone attending happy and feeling safe. We've got the Courtyard struggling with mask wearing not being mandated. Also hearing that their volunteer stewards are uncomfortable trying to enforce that. Harriet having that problem too. Staff shortages don't have the capacity while it's not in line with government guidance. And Turner Sims asking there, how do you deal with those that simply say, no, this is not a government requirement? So I'll just kick us off, if I may, to say that I think what this is about, it's about the one-to-many communications and the volume and the language of those communications. So not having to be aggressive or assertive at all, but really about at every single point in the journey emphasizing that mask wearing is a condition of entry. I don't think there is something that you can do to persuade an ardent anti-vaxxer or anti-masker who is standing in your foyer arguing with an usher to change their behaviour in that moment. You know, you can't deal with that, just move on. But it is about the kind of the one-to-many comms. Does anybody else want to come in on that?
I do think there's a bit of a tipping point on this as well, because I'm sure I'm not the only one who's gone into a place where I've fully intended to wear my mask, and then I've seen that I am the only person not doing so. That I'm the only person doing so when everybody else isn't, and therefore I'm kind of like, oh well, shall I just take mine off as well? So I think there becomes a sort of critical point where, you know, I think there could be a lot of people who would be perfectly happy to wear one, but if it looks like nobody is, they're not going to bother either. So I think it is. I also turned up to my dentist without my mask by mistake because I'd forgotten it. And as soon as I walked through the door, they said, "Oh, are you exempt?" And I went, "No, I've just forgotten it." And they gave me one. So I think offering those solutions and as your experience, Robin, kind of being really clear up front of what is going to be expected of you. You know, we will expect you to do this at every single point. Then hopefully the few, and I do think it will be a few that refuse to do it, we just go, fine, that's your choice, but they'll be the minority.
there's always a risk of confirmation bias, isn't there? But when I think back to that latter example, yeah, sure. Moments before the show started, as I looked around, the people who generally weren't wearing masks were generally men, aged generally around my kind of age, and I've noticed that a lot. And it was just really interesting to kind of see as the ushers started patrolling with the mask signs, guy after guy putting his mask on, being nudged by the person next to him. And so I think there are kind of subtleties of nudge behavior here, and it's about just dialing up the prevalence of that messaging. Thank you very much. Let's bring in Chichester Festival Theatre, who want to continue streaming productions, but find that it's the licensing from rights holders and the agreements from cast and creatives that's the major barrier. So, Chris, rights are incredibly complex. We can't solve that on this webinar, but I do want to ask you, when we've been asking audiences about engaging with organizations digitally, does that always mean a production, or does it mean other forms of digital engagement as well?
No, it doesn't. So yeah, I mean that's a huge barrier. If you don't own your own IP, or if you're beholden to rights holders, then that's a huge barrier. But it's not the only way to provide an experience online to someone. It's the thing that was so impressive almost 2 years ago when everyone started putting things online, is that they weren't just putting theatre online, but they were trying to innovate a business model around something that wasn't really that established. They were trying to do two difficult things at the same time. But actually, the thing that always strikes me is that there is a plethora of successful online business models out there that are based around the idea of entertaining an audience in some sort of creative way. And that might mean that you might need to think a little bit outside the bounds of what is considered theatre or what's considered a cultural experience. But there have been people doing this kind of work for some time now, and so that's kind of what I would encourage people to do. Look for the lower cost things where you're not beholden to those kinds of things. There's been some really successful examples of that in terms of entertainment experiences, classes, online communities. So I think, yeah, if you're blocked in the idea of trying to get putting a camera in front of actors on a stage, it's not the only thing that's possible out there. But that is the lens through which many venues will come at things. It's the lens that their artistic directors are most likely to think about, because years of training, experience, knowledge, and skill might kind of feel like it's going to waste if it's not being used in that way. But there are other ways of doing these things.
Thank you so much, Chris. Let's bring in a question here. David, I just wonder whether you can help us clear this up, given your deeper knowledge of the underlying data. Given 75% of respondents are over 55, do attitudes towards mask wearing and COVID, are they less positive for younger attenders? Is there anything in the data, David, that illustrates that?
Well, unfortunately, we don't have very many respondents who were under that age. And amongst those that did respond, there wasn't very much variation. So I'm not sure that I can directly give you a kind of answer to that one.
No problem. Thank you very much. So I can ask you to mute yourself because there's a bit of an echo when we both talk in the office. Thank you very much. So I think this is Stefano from Il Rossetti in Chester. Mask wearing compulsory in Italy, as well as proof of vaccination. No problem with audience presenting the QR code upon entering the theatre. Really, really interesting how the cultures around this are varying from country to country. I think I can also just bring in this one. How is mask wearing different to stopping people using their phones during shows? We're happy to do that without a government directive. Scottish Opera, great point here. Mask wearing is compulsory in theatres and concert hall in Scotland, and the experience is that the vast majority comply, but not all. Across all age ranges and gender, I did say there's a risk of confirmation bias. So I wonder if I can just put this question in this way then, and maybe bring in Rob McPherson's point here as well, where he's asking whether program is more or less of a factor in the decision to return, because what we've got is data that says, for example, that 55% of our holding outs are waiting until the COVID risk is lower than it is now. And that kind of begs two questions in my mind. One is, how will they know that the COVID risk is lower than it is now? How will we get to that point? And actually, is this really about risk versus reward? So it's some of the questions around kind of programming and so on. They actually become really important, because at the moment, going to the theatre feels like too big a risk for some people, but then their friend's 30th birthday comes along, or then that show that they've always wanted to see comes along, and the risk versus reward balance starts to tip. Any reflections from the panel on that?
That's certainly something I've been hearing anecdotally from venues about their sales figures, that they are seeing people book for those sort of big ticket items, and sort of almost, they're not going to take a risk on anything. So they might book their tickets for Adele or, some massive thing and spend huge amounts of money on it, rather than book for 6 things they're not quite sure about. And anecdotally, amongst my friends and peer groups, that seems to be what's going on as well. But I don't have any data to back that up. That's more a sort of feeling and what people are telling me from out there in the field. So I don't know whether that fits. And for the pricing thing, I mean, you guys are the pricing people, but for me, that suggests that if you get the product right, you probably can charge quite high prices for it, because people are coming less frequently. But it just makes it more risky for the organization. It's almost like, do less, that's the real big ticket items, and charge more for it. But it's like, oh, what does that do to diversity and inclusion and everything else in your business model? So I don't know.
We've been seeing around some of the digital ad campaigns that we've been running for shows. If it's a show that's got that's big, flashy, fun, got some great creative we can use in the ads, lovely reviews and things, where the risk of having a good time is really low, we're getting some really quite impressive returns on ad spend. Anything that is a bit of a harder push is really a hard push. So yeah, there's a really clear split between those two types of things.
Thanks very much. Sorry, David, go ahead.
I'm muted. No, I was just about to say, on Katie's point, I think that is actually what we're seeing from the organizations that we're working for as well. So I think, as well as anecdotally, it is actually there in the kind of the data that does suggest that people are, I think theatres have increased the prices of tickets, knowing that actually they need to be able to kind of recover their income kind of quickly. And certainly for those shows where there is genuinely kind of strong mass appeal, people have been happy to pay those higher prices. And of course, you're looking at a market which, as we just saw, is likely to be going less frequently than it had done in the past. So overall demand is going to be down. And as a result of that, they're going to be more selective about what they're going to, but they're not necessarily going to be spending less overall. They're just now focusing their spending on some of those kind of bigger shows that have more expensive tickets.
Thank you very much. And David, you'll see there, I've just brought up a question at the bottom of the screen about the data showing a surprising number of people wanting vaccine checks. And I just wonder if we could kind of clarify that. Is that's I don't think that's quite the question that we asked, whether they want vaccine checks. David, what was the exact wording on vaccine checks? I think it was making people more likely to book.
It was. All visitors or audiences showing proof of vaccine or negative COVID test in order to attend. And it would make them more or less likely to book.
Oh, you've gone off, Robin. We can't hear you.
Thank you very much. With some of these things, it's just worth stressing that it's we're looking at things in the round. It's not a combination. It's not an absolute, so we often have this discussion in pricing. If I drop a price from £40 to 50 pence, will that in itself make more people come? What we're looking at here is how you create a kind of package of measures that nudge people on a kind of journey from consideration to commitment, that classic journey that lots of marketers on the call will know about. And it's about creating the conditions within which then something can come along that will trigger the person into booking, the patient into booking, whether that is the product or so on. I think we're coming up on the hour, so we will wrap it up there. Huge thanks to everybody for attending. Thank you very much if your venue has been taking part in Missing Audiences. The second wave is coming up. Do please join it and take part in that. I also just want to thank, for the last year or more, Flo Carr from Indigo, Valentina de Sabater from Baker Richards, and Dominique Brook from Baker Richards have all been working really, really hard behind the scenes. We kind of present the webinars, and Flo and Valentina and Dominique have been doing most of the kind of and so on behind the scenes. So really, really grateful for them. We will be back in a couple of months' time with the next wave of Missing Audiences. Thank you so much for joining us today, and we will see you again very soon.